On the morning of July 1st, 1916, at precisely 7:30 a.m., whistles blew along the Allied trenches near the River Somme in northern France. Tens of thousands of men climbed out of their trenches and began walking toward the German lines. Walking, not running. Walking, because each man was carrying approximately 66 pounds of equipment: picks, shovels, sandbags, ammunition, rations, a load so heavy that moving faster than a slow walk was physically impossible. They had been told the German defenses had been destroyed by a week of continuous artillery bombardment. They had been told the barbed wire had been cut. They had been told they would face minimal resistance. They had been told wrong. The Germans had spent 2 years building their defensive positions. Their trenches were not shallow ditches, they were engineering works, concrete reinforced, 30 feet deep in places, with living quarters, command posts, and communication lines buried so far underground that the week of Allied bombardment, which fired 1.75 million shells, had barely touched them. When the barrage lifted and the British infantry appeared above the horizon, the German machine gunners climbed out of their intact shelters, set up their weapons, and opened fire. 57,470 British casualties in a single day, 19,240 of them dead. The worst day in the history of the British Army, before or since. The Battle of the Somme would continue for 141 days. When it ended, the Allied line had advanced 6 miles. 6 miles, at a total cost of over 1 million casualties on both sides. This is what World War I was. Not a war for territory, not a war for resources, not a war with a coherent strategic objective that anyone could articulate. A war that killed 20 million people in 4 years, for reasons that nobody, at the time or since, has ever convincingly explained. A war that the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck had predicted decades earlier with a precision that should have terrified everyone who heard it. "Some damn foolish thing in the Balkans," he said, "will set it all off." He was right, and by the time it was over, the world it had consumed was gone forever. To understand why a single assassination in Sarajevo in June 1914 produced a continental war within 6 weeks, you have to understand what Europe had become in the preceding decades. Because the war did not begin with a bullet. It began with 40 years of decisions, alliances, arms races, imperial competition, and political miscalculation that had turned Europe into a continent where every major power was simultaneously preparing for a war it claimed not to want. The Industrial Revolution had transformed the European economy over the course of the 19th century, and it had transformed European military capacity along with it. Steel, railroads, and industrial chemistry had produced weapons of a lethality that had no precedent in human experience. Machine guns that could fire 400 to 600 rounds per minute, artillery shells that could kill men half a mile from the point of impact, barbed wire, cheap, mass-produced, impossible to cross at speed, chemical weapons that had barely been imagined a generation earlier. All of it produced in factories at industrial scale, stockpiled in arsenals across the continent, ready to be deployed against populations that had no more idea what these weapons would do in combination than the generals who would order their use. The arms race had been running for years before 1914. Germany, the rising industrial power of continental Europe, had been building battleships at a rate that panicked the British Admiralty. The HMS Dreadnought, launched in 1906, was a revolution in naval design, so powerful it made every other battleship in the world obsolete. Germany immediately began building its own dreadnoughts. Britain responded by building faster. By the outbreak of war in 1914, Britain had 29 dreadnoughts and Germany had 17. The financial cost was staggering. Britain had increased its annual naval expenditure from £31 million to £50 million in a decade. And this was only the naval component of an arms race that was simultaneously running on land, in the air, and in the laboratories developing the first generation of chemical weapons. Alongside the arms race ran a system of alliances that had divided Europe into 2 armed camps, each bound by treaty obligations to support the other in the event of conflict. The Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, faced the Triple Entente, Britain, France, and Russia. These alliances had been constructed over decades as insurance policies against aggression, but they had a catastrophic design flaw. They meant that any conflict between any 2 powers could, through the automatic triggering of treaty obligations, escalate into a continent-wide war within days. The system had no circuit breaker. It had no mechanism for de-escalation. It was, as German Chancellor Bismarck had recognized, a powder keg. And by 1914, it had been accumulating explosive pressure for a generation. There was also another force driving Europe toward catastrophe: one that the textbooks often list but rarely fully explain. The generals had a timing problem. The major European powers had been developing detailed war plans for years. The Germans had the Schlieffen Plan, France had Plan 17, Russia had its own mobilization schedules. All of these plans were built around the railroad, the new technology that could move armies of 1 million men to the front in days rather than months. But railroad mobilization was irreversible. Once you started moving troops by rail toward the border, stopping and reversing the process would take weeks. In the crisis summer of 1914, as political leaders frantically tried to find a diplomatic solution to the Austro-Serbian dispute, their generals were quietly telling them, "If we wait any longer to mobilize, we lose the window. We will be outmaneuvered before we have fired a shot." The politicians were still trying to talk. The generals were already issuing railway timetables. And then, on June 28, 1914, a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb student named Gavrilo Princip stepped out of a crowd in Sarajevo and shot the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. It was not a carefully planned operation. The assassination attempt had already failed earlier that morning. A bomb thrown at the Archduke's car had bounced off and exploded under a different vehicle. Princip had given up and gone to a nearby delicatessen. He was standing outside, eating a sandwich when the Archduke's driver, who had not been told of the new escape route, took a wrong turn and pulled up directly in front of him. Princip stepped forward. He fired 2 shots from a distance of 5 feet. The war that killed 20 million people happened because of a wrong turn, a missed assassination attempt, and a man eating a sandwich. But of course it did not happen only because of those things. It happened because the powder keg was already built, because the alliances were already drawn, because the railroad timetables were already written, because 40 years of arms racing and imperial competition and nationalist escalation had created a system so taut that almost anything could have triggered it. Princip's bullet was the spark. The fuel had been accumulating for a generation. The war that began in August 1914 was not the war anyone expected. Every major European power had planned for a short war. The Germans expected to defeat France in 6 weeks and then turn east against Russia. The French expected their offensive spirit, élan, the doctrine of aggressive attack, to carry the day. The British expected to use their naval superiority to blockade Germany into submission within months. The generals on all sides had planned for a war of movement, cavalry charges, strategic flanking maneuvers, decisive victories on open ground. What they got instead was the trench. Within weeks of the opening campaigns, both sides had dug into the earth, and the Western Front had stabilized into a line of opposing trenches stretching 450 miles from the English Channel to the Swiss border. The combination of machine guns, barbed wire, and artillery had made open ground assault suicidal and made the defensive position essentially impregnable to any force that the generals of 1914 knew how to deploy. The technology of killing had outrun the technology of movement by a generation. Weapons that could kill at 600 rounds per minute existed. Vehicles that could cross barbed wire and shell-torn ground at speed did not yet exist. And into that gap, between the weapons that defended and the weapons that could attack, went the bodies of the men. The trench was not a temporary expedient. It became a world. A civilization of mud and timber and corrugated iron that stretched the length of a continent and housed millions of men for years. The conditions were medieval in their squalor and industrial in their violence. Trenches flooded in rain. They froze in winter. They were infested with rats, enormous rats, fed to obesity on the bodies of the dead in no man's land, who would run across sleeping men's faces at night and were so numerous and so bold that they could not be controlled. They were infested with lice, which lived in the seams of the men's clothing and could not be permanently removed regardless of how many times the uniforms were boiled and fumigated. Men developed trench foot, a condition caused by standing in cold water for extended periods, which caused the flesh of the feet to swell, rot, and in extreme cases necessitate amputation. They developed trench fever. They developed shell shock, a condition that the military largely refused to recognize as legitimate, that courts-martialed and sometimes executed men for cowardice, who were in fact experiencing what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. And above all of it, constant and unceasing, the artillery. The artillery of World War I operated at a scale that had no precedent in human history. At Verdun, the 10-month battle in 1916 where the German command explicitly planned to kill French soldiers faster than France could replace them, a strategy the German chief of staff described as bleeding the French army white. The two sides fired an estimated 40 million shells over the course of the battle. The ground around Verdun was so completely destroyed by artillery that it has never been reclaimed for agriculture. It is still contaminated today, with unexploded shells, with chemical weapon residue, with human remains that were so thoroughly mixed into the earth by the bombardment that they could not be separated from it. More than 100,000 men at Verdun were officially listed as missing in action. They were not missing. They had been so thoroughly destroyed by artillery that no identifiable remains existed. The total casualties at Verdun, approximately 700,000. The territory gained by the German offensive, none. The German lines at the end of 10 months of fighting were essentially where they had started. And then came the gas. The first large-scale use of poison gas was at Ypres in April 1915. 168 tons of chlorine released from cylinders along the German front line, carried toward the Allied trenches by the wind. The greenish-yellow cloud drifted across no man's land and into the trenches. Chlorine attacks the respiratory system. Men who breathed it in sufficient concentration drowned in their own fluid-filled lungs. Over 15,000 casualties in a single attack, a third of them fatal. The soldiers who survived described a smell like a mixture of pineapple and pepper, and the visual of men clawing at their throats and turning blue as their airways closed. The Allies developed gas masks within weeks. The Germans developed mustard gas, a different weapon entirely. Mustard gas did not kill through the lungs. It was heavier than air, settling into the low ground, seeping into trenches, contaminating clothing and soil for weeks. It caused blistering of any skin it contacted, permanent damage to eyes, and severe chemical burns to the respiratory system. The majority of mustard gas victims survived, but they survived blinded, scarred, and incapacitated. They survived in ways that required years of medical care and left them permanently damaged. The weapon was not designed primarily to kill. It was designed to disable, to burden the medical system, to create suffering that persisted long after the battle. This was the logic of industrial war, not victory, attrition, the deliberate infliction of mass casualties at a rate that would make the enemy's position strategically untenable. The goal was not to defeat the enemy, it was to kill more of them than they killed of you, until one side ran out of men. 1916 was the year the industrial logic of attrition reached its fullest and most terrible expression. 2 battles, 1 year, 3 million casualties. Verdun began in February. The Somme began in July. The 2 battles overlapped. Indeed, the Somme was partly launched to relieve the pressure on the French at Verdun, where the French army was being systematically destroyed by the German offensive. Both battles followed the same essential pattern: massive preliminary artillery bombardment, infantry assault, catastrophic casualties, minimal territorial gain. Repeat until the commanders ran out of justifications or the politicians ran out of patience. The first day of the Somme, July 1st, 1916, remains the defining day of the entire war for the British national memory. 57,470 casualties before noon. The men who went over the top that morning were not regular soldiers. They were Kitchener's army. Volunteers who had signed up in 1914 in response to a recruitment campaign, civilians who had left their jobs and their families and their communities to serve. Many of them were in PALS battalions, units formed from friends, neighbors, and workmates from the same town or street who had enlisted together and been kept together in the same unit. The logic was that men would fight better alongside people they knew. The consequence was that when a PALS battalion was destroyed, and at the Somme, entire battalions were destroyed, the losses fell on a single community with a completeness that tore the social fabric of that place apart. The Accrington PALS, 720 men from a single Lancashire mill town, suffered 584 casualties on July 1st alone. The men advanced slowly, carrying their 66-pound packs across no man's land toward the German lines. The barbed wire had not been cut. The artillery shells had failed to cut it, and in several places the men found themselves funneling through gaps in the wire, clustering at the few openings, presenting concentrated targets to the machine guns. Some battalions were destroyed in seconds. Officers walking at the front of their men were shot before they had gone 20 yards. The supporting waves following behind them were shot walking over the bodies of the men in front. After the first day, the battle continued for 141 days. The generals continued it because the French needed the relief at Verdun, because the investment in men and material had already been made, and stopping felt like admitting failure, because there was a theory, always a theory, that one more push would produce the breakthrough. The breakthrough never came. The line moved 6 miles at a cost of over 1 million casualties. Wilfred Owen, the greatest poet of the First World War, killed 1 week before the armistice, wrote of the gas attacks he witnessed with a fury that has not diminished in 100 years. He described men dying in a gas attack as drowning in a green sea, their eyes writhing in their faces, their blood gargling from froth-corrupted lungs, like a devil sick of sin. He titled the poem after a line from the Roman poet Horace, a line that had been used to glorify dying in battle for 2,000 years. It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. Owen's poem exists to tell you that it is a lie, that there is nothing sweet or fitting about the particular form of dying that the industrial machinery of 1914 to 1918 produced, that the machinery did not care about sweetness or fitness, it only cared about efficiency. The Christmas truce of December 1914 is famous, the moment when German and British soldiers climbed out of their trenches, met in no man's land, exchanged cigarettes and handshakes, and played football. It happened. It was real. And then it ended, and the soldiers went back to their trenches, and the killing resumed, and nobody in command on either side allowed it to happen again. Because the point of the war was not to resolve anything. The point of the war was to continue until one side had killed enough of the other to force a decision. And killing efficiently required that the soldiers not remember each other as human beings. The war ended on November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m. The armistice took effect at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, a timing chosen for its symmetry, for the poetry of the numbers, for the sense that history should organize itself into memorable patterns. In the final hours before the armistice took effect, both sides continued fighting. Orders were issued, offensives were launched, men were sent forward, and men died, up until the final minute. American records show 11,000 casualties on the last morning of the war. More casualties in the final morning than on D-Day in 1944. The war ended at 11 a.m. Men were dying at 10:59. The final accounting, 20 million dead, 21 million wounded, 4 empires dissolved, the German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman. The map of Europe and the Middle East, redrawn by men in conference rooms who had not fought in the war and who drew the new borders with as little regard for the populations they affected as they had shown for the soldiers they had sent to die. The borders they drew in the Middle East, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the Balfour Declaration, the mandates carved from the Ottoman corpse, are the foundations of conflicts that are still killing people today. And then, to ensure that the catastrophe would be repeated, the victors wrote the Treaty of Versailles. The economist John Maynard Keynes attended the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 as a British Treasury official. He watched the negotiations. He saw what was being done to Germany, the reparations demands, the territorial stripping, the war guilt clause that assigned sole responsibility for the war to Germany, the economic strangulation that the treaty would impose on a country of 60 million people. He resigned from the British delegation in protest. He went home and immediately wrote a book. The Economic Consequences of the Peace, published in 1919, predicted with extraordinary precision that the Versailles settlement would destroy the German economy, produce hyperinflation and mass unemployment, generate a political crisis that existing German institutions could not contain, and ultimately produce another war within a generation. He was right on every count, every single one. The war that nobody could explain had produced a peace that guaranteed its own sequel. 20 million dead, and the diplomats who survived them had arranged the world so that their children would have to do it again, with better weapons, at larger scale, and with the deliberate targeting of civilian populations that the First War had only partially introduced. Wilfred Owen did not live to see the Second War. He was killed on November 4th, 1918, crossing the Somme Canal with his battalion under fire 7 days before the armistice. His mother received the telegram informing her of his death on the morning of November 11th, as the church bells of Shrewsbury were ringing to celebrate the end of the war. The machine that ate soldiers had one final thing to say, and it said it in the cruelest possible way, to the cruelest possible audience, at the cruelest possible moment. The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. And still the telegram arrived,